All right. Hello, everyone. This is My Two Cents, and welcome back to the weekly COVID-19 update. As it has been the case every week since we started doing this stream, there is quite a bit that has taken place in the last week. But I decided that from this point forward, I do want to start off every one of these streams by pointing out what the current U.S. national debt is and the Federal Reserve balance sheet. And as of close of
Good
business on
idea.
Friday, the U.S. national debt is now at approximately $24,193,100,000,000, and the Fed's balance sheet has expanded to $6.6 trillion, which was which I think went up a total of $205.2 billion this week. So, with that, the first thing in the news that I thought we should talk about, and I say the first thing because this was earlier this week, but as I'm sure everyone was aware, for the first time in history, oil prices actually went negative. So rather than even giving away oil for free, people actually had to pay other people to have oil taken off their hands, which shows just how much of a lack of demand there is for oil, obviously due to the government shutdown and the COVID-19 situation, but nonetheless, pretty historic event.
Also, because OPEC starting to default on its loans, which I'd say is probably more the cause than the shutdown of the legal market.
Yeah, perfect storm of causation there. But for those who don't know, when as to why oil prices actually went negative, has a lot to do with the fact that providers trade these futures contracts, they're called. So it's much like stock options. If you buy a futures contract in oil, you're essentially promising to buy a certain amount of oil at a certain price at some point in the future. And you buy that contract expecting that the price will actually be higher. And then, you've locked in that price and you buy the oil for a lower than market price and then sell it at a profit. The only problem is with the lack of demand for oil, the people who had purchased these contracts now have no one to sell it to, but also nowhere to store it. And because storing oil obviously takes space and specific conditions, so they now have contracts where they've promised to buy a certain amount of oil at a certain price, but they don't have anywhere to store it. So their only choice is to pay other people to either keep it or take it off their hands, since they've already promised to buy it at a certain price.
And by the way, unless you're a state licensed corporation like Exxon or whatever, you're not going to be able to obtain one of these, because my first thought, just like a lot of the neets on the internet, when I heard that people were just giving oil away, I was like, fuck, I'll just rent a warehouse and then get like 10,000 barrels of it.
Sounds like a good idea to me.
Become a multi-billionaire overnight. But yeah, you're not going to be able to do that unless you have a license from the state, which they're not just giving away for that reason. Exactly that reason.
Well, I mean, what you would need is some kind of black market contact who works in a chemical company who is willing to give you oil. And this does happen, especially in third world countries like Venezuela. I mean, that's pretty much how the oil smuggling business works. Trouble is that America and American companies are not nearly going to be that receptive, so it's going to be a lot riskier. And although it is possible, because, well, there is such a thing as oil evaporation, that the amounts that are smuggled out typically don't usually get missed. Though I don't think conditions in the United States are going to be very similar to Venezuela. If you could pull it off, that would very much be a very useful thing to have, and especially for any coming economic catastrophe, having even like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 barrels on hand of crude oil, if you could find a way to refine it into more useful materials like gasoline, that would still be like a fantastic asset to have. However, for the time being, I think we'll kind of have to, until we figure out the best way to get physical barrels full of oil into our hands, there's not going to be a very reliable way to, really exploit this.
Yeah, my idea wasn't to use all that oil. My idea was to become like a was, of course, to sell it back once it became profitable again, and then become like a reverse George Soros.
Oh, wow.
Just funding a bunch of counter-economic projects everywhere.
Sounds like a plan to me, honestly. Sounds like a good one, too.
I mean, now the best thing to do is just to buy gold and silver. I mean, oil would also have been a very valuable asset that would have skyrocketed in value once hyperinflation hit. And let's be honest here, like we all know that hyperinflation is going to hit as a result of this, because
literally.
Because U.S. dollar, it's pegged largely to demand for oil around the world, and since oil has basically become entirely worthless, well, yeah, that's going to be fun.
Exactly.
It's getting hit from 3 fronts. For one, all of the QE cycles the state's been going over for the last 2 months or so, just daily billions of dollars being printed and given out, to the point where they're really not even talking about it when they do it, and when they do it anymore, or it gets very little attention when they do it. It only gets attention every once in a while when the QE cycle goes into the trillions, which has happened a few times. You know, and just for a refresher, the entirety of the 2009 bailout was $800 billion. So we're far beyond that point right now.
Oh,
but
absolutely.
As soon as people actually start spending at the same rate that they were prior to the start of the Depression, that's going to immediately cause hyperinflation, because what will happen is you'll get all this money in circulation, which has been printed by the government and just given to loaning firms in order to supply loans with. And as a result, you'll have just all this money everywhere. You'll have an abundance of it to the point where it's not even really that valuable. So it'll become almost worthless. Then, of course, as discussed earlier, there's the OPEC loan default situation going on right now, where a lot of the loans being created by OPEC are defaulting because central banks around the world are defaulting. And we've discussed petrodollar recycling previously, where the the United States government and the European Union use OPEC loans in order to manufacture demand for their fiat currencies by making other countries pay back their loans in US dollars and euros. And then, of course, the third front, which the US dollar and other central bank currencies are being hit on, is the fact that central banks around the world are defaulting, because another trick that governments like the US and the European Union have used to manufacture demand for their loans is to force those countries through treaties and organizations like the IMF or through the World Trade Organization to buy US dollars and euros to back up their own central bank's currency. Since their central banks are defaulting, it's pretty obvious to see what the problem is there. So essentially, no matter what, we have hyperinflation coming in the near future.
Mm-hmm. The only thing the government can do to try to hold it off at this point is try to manufacture more uncertainty and more that makes people want to save their money as opposed to spend it. Which, of course,
what were you going to say?
I was going to say, which of course makes sense when you consider how the mainstream media is constantly talking about how it's not time. People are going to die if we go right back to work. We got to continue these stay-at-home orders. Basically a variation of the think of the children fallacy, but just again and again that everyone's going to die from the coronavirus. We've got to take increasingly drastic measures and everything else, because that uncertainty is the only thing that's keeping people saving as opposed to spending.
Well, propaganda hasn't really been effective from a social perspective. The only thing that's really stopping people from spending is the fact that the state has used force to shut down all these legal businesses or only allowed them to trade with a certain amount of people.
Yes, but again, the actual uncertainty is the only thing that's between. Yes, they're actually forcibly shutting down businesses, which of course is leading to all these protests. People are losing their businesses, losing their jobs, wanting to be able to go back to work, and the propaganda machine is trying to make people more and more uncertain. And I think if you look at what happened in post World War I Weimar Germany, was that the government increased the supply of currency by about 400% during World War I, yet there was no corresponding inflation. And the reason for that was because the times were so uncertain, people were saving their money as opposed to spending it. But when the war was over and confidence started to resume and people actually brought all that stored up currency out of hiding and started spending it, and prices started to double on a daily basis, that's when and people then realize that the currency is worthless, that at that point there's nothing the government can do to fix it. When the populace's eyes are open, they realize if they hang on to their currency for any amount of time, they're going to get burned. They just start selling as fast as they can, trying to get rid of trade their currency for whatever they can get their hands on, because they know if they hang on to it for any amount of time, they're going to get burned. And at that point, the government, there's nothing they can do to correct the hyperinflation.
Basic translation for a good strategy: start buying cryptocurrency, start hoarding up precious metals, do whatever you can, but do not depend on the dollar. It's going down, and it's going down fast.
Exactly.
It's going down in flames.
Oh, like the Hindenburg.
It's gonna. They're basically, the government has set itself up for a death spiral, where its measures to keep the lights on for another 5 minutes, which is entirely what it's incentivized to do, are all going to contribute to the collapse of the currency. It's the same thing we saw in Weimar Germany. It's the same thing we saw in Austria. It's the same thing we saw in Yugoslavia. It's the same thing we saw in South Africa. Same thing we saw in Zimbabwe. Same thing we saw in Venezuela. We're probably going to see it in the UK very soon, and we're going to see it in America in the not too distant future.
And for the record, we mentioned this on some of the previous streams, but monetary historians have studied state-issued currencies stretching back to the dawn of civilization, and every state-issued fiat currency inevitably crashes in hyperinflation.
Yeah, now I just want to answer a question real quick posed by Zachary Cawley, who asks what I recommend in order to set up underground churches, hypothetically. They're going to be live streamed. Church sermons and services are going to be distributed over the internet. I haven't really been saying that all that often, but I do genuinely believe that the internet is very much going to be the future in terms of where the church is and where the word of God is going to be shared.
All right. Moving on quick, because obviously this will play into a lot of other news that's come up this week. But the next thing to mention that we wanted to mention, in the state of New York, they have now issued do not resuscitate guidelines for cardiac patients amid coronavirus. This is an article from the New York Post published on April 21st. And New York State has issued a drastic new guideline urging emergency services workers not to bother trying to revive anyone without a pulse when they get to the scene amid an overload of coronavirus patients. Well, paramedics were previously told to spend up to 20 minutes trying to revive people found in cardiac arrest. The change is, quote, necessary during the COVID-19 response to protect the health and safety of EMS providers by limiting their exposure, conserve resources, and ensure optimal use of equipment to save the greatest number of lives.
You know, I remember seeing this remark just a day or so ago, but I think it's worth repeating here. Only the government can make hospitals go bankrupt during a pandemic.
That was from Sal the Agorist. I saw that too.
And it's very much amazing that hospitals, despite the fact that this should be the boom time, this is like the days that any privately owned hospital should be salivating over, because they just get an absolute boom in demand for resources or for their services, and they're just going to be getting tons of money. The idea that in a pandemic that they can't have the resources to can't have the resources to resuscitate cardiac patients is absolutely insane. And I'm also reminded of this argument that I hear. Well, I mean, I've been hearing it in my entire life, but now it's just like, oh, you don't want the lockdowns to continue on in perpetuity. Well, you just want people to die. Meanwhile, the people who are actually instituting the lockdowns are making overt recommendations, or not even recommendations, overt orders, not to let people die. So
Yeah,
I'm
or
very
if
much
they-
curious. Who is it that wants people to die again? Who wants people to die again?
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
get the state more involved in hospital services so that they have to depend more on rationing. That ends up creating situations like this where hospitals are unable to deal with increased demand, or situations where police will start harassing people, beating people, or shooting them for even leaving their home.
Hmm.
Sounds like we're the ones who want people to die, all right. Oh, don't even get me started on what the NHS is doing.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, what's most tragic in all this is you still have the Bernie Bros saying that what's currently going on in the United States healthcare system is proof that we need universal healthcare.
Oh, for
Oh
God's
God.
sakes.
Wow.
I mean, isn't that exactly what small government and no government people said exactly what was going to happen when when the Obamacare debate was going on? That this system was being primed up to fail once again, so that when it does fail, people are going to be demanding for socialized healthcare. Isn't that
absolutely.
exactly what we predicted?
Hmm.
Yeah, and you see
Weird.
what's going on in the NHS over in Britain right now, Italy, Spain, all these other nations that do in fact have single payer healthcare, which are their healthcare system is doing far worse than the United States even.
They actually go out of their way to deliberately kill people in order to save up resources. In the NHS is a particularly ghoulish example, because
exactly.
they've started just assuming that people are organ donors. They don't even have to say that they're organ donors, and then they'll kill them, even if they'll just refuse to give them any service, even if it's a condition they could have survived, so that they'll die and then they can harvest their organs.
Yeah.
That's something the NHS has started doing in the last couple of months.
Plus, in just in the last couple of years, and I'm pretty sure it's been going on for a lot longer than this. The perception of the NHS is I want to say there's a kind of religious fervor around the NHS, and this is very much being reinforced by Fusion. Listen in the comments that have we heard about the clap for the NHS gimmick?
I was
we
just
have.
about to bring that up.
And it's just entirely cultish mentality around that the NHS is basically God's greatest gift to mankind.
God, wow. Also, I wanted to bring this up on what J.C. Armitage said when he was talking about the NHS. That sounds like some NHS bullshit or BS right there. I think that was also a reference to what the NHS was doing kind of before this, because and pretty much anywhere else where you see universal health care. And I'm even going to quote the debate that Paul Ryan had with Bernie Sanders, where in America, the elderly and those that those that are truly sick, they actually get the health care that they need. They get the health care that they paid for. In places where they have like the NHS or any kind of universal healthcare system, you're basically put into a ward. You're basically put into like a room, and you're told this is your time to go. Pretty much, you're basically told it's your time to die. This is all we can do for you. Yada yada yada. I believe that was kind of what it was going, and that's what we're seeing now here. Unfortunately, that's really what we're seeing now, and it's really, God, what are we doing?
And keep in mind, I think the fact that the healthcare in the United States doesn't actually improve or doesn't become more productive in the time of a pandemic, that alone should be a refutation of the idea that this is just a no holds barred free market. Like, is constantly suggested or insinuated by state media and politicians.
Oh, absolutely. It's not a free market, but also one thing that we're really seeing is how well we're seeing it everywhere between the United States, between Britain, Spain, Italy, all these other countries. But whether they have single payer healthcare, whether they have so heavily regulated healthcare system such that it's basically socialized healthcare like what you have in the United States. Is the economic calculation problem that results when government tries to get involved in the distribution of goods and services. The state of New York is, well, I know earlier this week, there was also a discussion how a couple weeks ago, Andrew Cuomo was talking about how the state of New York needs more ventilators. We don't have enough ventilators to actually treat COVID patients. And of course, the federal government has nationalized GM and Ford and these other companies in order to make more ventilators. Well, ventilators show up in New York only to find out that they don't actually need all the ventilators that got sent to New York. However, there are other places around the nation where they do need ventilators, which again goes to show that without allowing prices to rise and fall based on demand, it is impossible to accurately allocate the right amount of resources anywhere. And the more heavily the government tries to get involved in making those kinds of decisions, the more screwed up it ends up being. You always end up with huge surpluses of resources in places that don't need it, and huge shortages in places where you do need it.
Oh, this is actually a big funny plot twist I saw just a day or two ago about ventilators, where New York doctors are actually recommending that their patients not go on ventilators because the COVID patients that do go on ventilators have a 90% fatality rate. And no one's entirely sure why this is the case, but it seems to be that those who do go on ventilators, it seems to exaggerate their symptoms. It seems to prevent any sort of natural curative process that would occur. For some reason that is not entirely clear, the doctors now believe that ventilators are actually making things worse. So all of this thing involving Trump patting himself in the back, printing like a peacock about how wonderful and great he is for sending ventilators. Well, there's a good chance that ventilators are actually killing people. But no, we got to shut down our entire economy and have entire segments of our manufacturing sector put entirely to things that the government has deemed valuable. And I can guarantee you that this information will not reach any decisions with the government and will not stop any manufacturing processes of ventilators until months after it's already entered the public consciousness and it's already become common knowledge that ventilators just make things worse. And so what you're going to have is just like this gigantic stockpile of useless ventilators that literally nobody wants.
And considering that it recently came to light that the U.S. government and the World Health Organization, the two groups which primarily promote the use of ventilators to fight COVID-19 symptoms, were recently exposed to be heavily involved in the speculative process in that Wuhan lab which manufactured the virus. You know, that raises some interesting questions. Like, did they manufacture the virus knowing that people would be more likely to die from it if they were put on a ventilator and are now putting people on ventilators so that they'll die?
Of course, even asking that question just makes you a kooky conspiracy theorist who belongs in the loony bin.
I mean, the state would absolutely have an interest in killing a bunch of their population.
Oh, absolutely. And the fact that the virus primarily is affecting the elderly also plays in with the narrative of population control and removing individuals who are, least contributing the least to the state's overall goals, that being the elderly. Of course, I don't claim to be able to prove that, but the point is, like what Esso's pointing out with the incentive structure between the lab in Wuhan, the World Health Organization, and the United States, you can't deny the motives are there. But yet, even trying to ask the question, you'll be jumped on and called a crazy conspiracy theorist.
Oh god, I've been called a crazy conspiracy theorist just for pointing out that there is a protein in just for pointing out that there is a protein in COVID-19 in the virus that would not occur naturally,
But
which
all I was
nowadays isn't even controversial anymore.
But all I was going to add on to that is absolutely the government would have an interest in trying to cut down on the production that takes place within their legal society. And keep in mind, labor is a type of production, is an asset to some firms. So you are considered an asset in the state's eyes. So the state would absolutely have an incentive in killing off a bunch of people because unlike a firm which is just trading and producing in order to make ends meet that thrives on production, uh, regardless of whatever means of trade that they're operating around. Governments fundamentally, or just anything which operates around a rationing scheme, fundamentally relies upon stagnation and needs production to be quashed in order to sustain itself, because more production for something which relies upon a rationing model means that it makes it more difficult for them to consistently distribute their resources, and it overloads the bureaucracy they have set up to try and determine how those resources should be distributed. They don't have any price signals, so they just have a bunch of these arbitrary decisions that they have to make.
Exactly. Economic calculation problem again. The government can't possibly be in possession of all the information necessary to accurately predict how much of every resource every person's going to need and where it needs to go. And that's why, even going back to the Great Depression, which, we're basically in the next Great Depression at this point. But during the Great Depression, we've got people starving in the streets, and the government is destroying produce and food resources in order to artificially keep the prices at the right levels.
Yeah, I mean, that's not even really speculation. That's just sort of, what we can observe based on the incentives of an organization which rations resources. It's not.
I mean,
it's not
it's
a
amazing.
conspiracy theory.
It's amazing what happens when you shut down the overwhelming majority of restaurants in the United States. Suddenly, there's reduced demand for food from the producers, from farms. They have to cut down on production, or for all the production that they did already create, because farms plant their seeds like weeks or months in advance in anticipation of future demand. This is something that they've been doing year after year after year. So why would they think that artificial demand would go? Why would they think that demand at all, would go down because of a pandemic that they can't possibly predict or plan for? So with this in mind, you have a whole bunch of produce, a whole bunch of meat, a whole bunch of dairy, a whole bunch of stuff that simply isn't being produced, or it has to be destroyed because it's otherwise just going to rot in a warehouse. Now, sure, the government's already been doing this for many years now, where they destroy millions of tons of produce, meat, food, dairy every year in order to artificially keep prices high. But nowadays, it's like we're looking at looming food shortages, exactly like what we predicted would happen. And somehow people are going to be incredibly, incredibly surprised by this. And by the way, you got a super chat.
Yes, I know. Zachary Cawley, thank you very much. He says, if you haven't bought seed already, do it now.
Right.
Yes. I mean, you're not going to be able. There's a very good chance that in the not too distant future, you're simply not going to be able to go to the grocery store. So supplementing any supplies you already have with stuff that you can grow, it's definitely going to be extremely helpful.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's I'm already like, when me and my family go to the store, I'm already seeing prices start to go crazy. For instance, the other day, we went to a grocery store in like the nut section. We buy sunflower seeds a lot. My dad does, so that he can put them in like little Ziploc bags. And but I digress. We saw macadamia nuts, which were inside of like a little plastic container about the size of like your average cat food bowl, I would say, and that cost $15. And I mean, macadamia nuts are pretty expensive regularly, but just that's ridiculous even for them.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's just an indication that some commodities are already experiencing a shortage.
And the shortages are only going to get worse the longer this goes on and the longer we stay shut down, which, of course, it looks like between the various state governments, they're still extending. There are some states like Georgia that are trying to roll back their stay-at-home orders, but there are other states like Michigan, which we discussed last week, which are now extending their stay-at-home orders. So the longer the shutdown takes place, the greater the shortages are going to be and the greater the impact in the long term. Anyways, next thing I wanted to discuss, I thought this was particularly significant. I'm looking right now at an article that was published in Bloomberg, April 23rd, 2020. Remember when Donald Trump said during his State of the Union address, America will never be a socialist nation, and all the MAGA hat-wearing folks cheered because Donald Trump is the pro-capitalist, awesome president that we know we need him to be. He will fight against socialism and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the Bernie Bros and all those other crazies that the MAGA hat-wearing folks despise.
Barely a year later, it seems he's gone completely the opposite direction.
Oh, yeah.
Indeed. So here, getting to the point of the article, Steve Mnuchin, the current Secretary of the Treasury under Donald Trump, asks for equity stakes in exchange for $17 billion in aid. What does that mean? So basically, the Treasury Secretary there's another bailout round of bailouts coming out for public companies that are deemed critical to national security. But companies that accept this bailout money to prevent them from going under must offer equity in the company to the United States government. Oh. And for private companies, Mnuchin says he may, in his discretion, accept senior debt instruments or other financial interests from these companies. So basically, the federal government is saying to businesses out there, yeah, we will keep bailing you out, but you have to offer us ownership in your companies. And if you are not a publicly traded company, you basically have to go in debt to the U.S. government. Which is effectively the same thing as the U.S. government owning them anyways.
That just sounds like socialism with extra steps.
Which, of course, is why I titled this stream, Republicans Institute State Ownership of the Means of Production, because what else do you call that other than when government actually owns the businesses?
Here's the thing that I've noticed, though. $17 billion is a really tiny amount of money for bailouts as far as bailouts are concerned. Now, don't get me wrong, like $17 billion, that is a crap ton of money. If they decide to quote unquote bail me out with $17 billion, like I would be set for life easily. However, for businesses and the kind of scope of the bailouts that we've seen, like they've just been throwing around money in the hundreds of billions a lot. So $17 billion, I got a feeling that this is really targeted at a very small number of companies, like very specific. Like I know that Boeing is very interested in this money, and I'm actually genuinely surprised that Boeing isn't already like basically completely owned by the government as a majority stockholder already. But suffice to say that, yeah, this is, I think, probably at least the start of a future trend where the government is very much going to have an equity stake in a lot of companies. And actually would not be surprised if they use their equity stake in order to try to get private businesses to become holders of government debt. I mean, how plausible does that sound?
Oh, wow. Nice super chat there.
John Smith, thank you very much. He says, should we call it hollow state socialism? Cheat engineer.
I mean, that would be a completely plausible direction. The more leverage that states have over their business actors in the legal market, the better the state's doing. The more leverage it means that it has over every aspect of your life.
But anyways, it just goes to show again that for those who still buy into the whole right-left dichotomy, you basically have the state, and whether there's a Republican in office, whether there's a Democrat in office, we've seen over the past 200 years only two things happen: federal spending increases, and the government grows in the size and scope of its authority. Sometimes it happens slower, sometimes it happens faster, but it happens all along, such that we have, Donald Trump is the hero of the political right at this point, the most sound, free market, right wing, conservative values president we've had in the past 2 decades, according to most of them. And a year after saying America will never be a socialist nation, his administration is actively working to nationalize businesses.
Oh, Isaac Clarke. Anyone who says that America is following a free market model, they need to get their heads examined because they don't know what the hell they're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow.
I'm sorry, who's saying what now?
Oh, I'm just responding to a comment by Isaac Clarke.
The people are going to... It's just, at this point, the idea that we live in a free country is entirely just rhetoric. That might have been plausible 150 years ago, but nowadays it's like that's kind of an anachronism, since this is very much the land of the free and the home of the slave, as what's his name puts it.
Brian from High Impact.
Yeah, that's the one.
All right, next thing to take a look at. This article comes from Market Watch, but a former Fed official says that the U.S. Central Bank should do the formerly unthinkable, take interest rates below zero. I'm sure it's been a couple weeks since this came up on the stream, but pretty much right when this popped off, the Federal Reserve lowered interest rates to zero and has since drastically expanded its quantitative easing program. Again, I mentioned its balance sheet is $6.6 billion now. It's buying up every bond, every debt instrument, every junk bond it possibly can to try to keep the economy afloat. At this point, I'm not aware that the Fed is actually purchasing stock in businesses, although I think that's coming, and especially given that the Secretary of the Treasury says he wants equity in businesses, I think that's coming. But what the Federal Reserve, at least the Central Bank of the United States, has not yet done, which its European counterparts have, is institute negative interest rates, which are exactly what they sound like. If an interest rate is the price of a loan, you pay 2-3% interest on the money you borrow. You have to pay back both the money you borrowed and the certain percentage extra in interest, which is traditionally how banks make money. A negative interest rate would mean that your money is so worthless that the bank actually has to pay you to hang on to it. So they loan you a certain amount of money and then pay you more money over time in order to hang on to that money. And this, of course, a quote here from the article: unprecedented situations require unprecedented actions. That's why the U.S. Federal Reserve should fight a rapidly deepening recession by taking interest rates below zero for the first time ever.
Yeah, so if that happens, you know the deal. Run down to your bank or credit union and take out everything that you still have in there, if you still have anything in there in the first place.
Yeah, the whole idea of negative interest rates is rather difficult for a lot of people to wrap their heads around. So we can just distill it down to a few simple steps. Get money out of your bank because it's going to cost you to keep it in there. It is literally more profitable for people to keep money under their mattress than in a bank. With this in mind, I can guarantee you that there's going to be a lot of people with a lot of savings, including businesses, just rich folks in general, who are also going to figure this out. And this is going to be the real danger of negative interest rates. Now, of course, this whole recommendation is coming from one person who isn't with the Federal Reserve banks anymore, but it's still very indicative that this kind of idea is starting to float around a lot more commonly. And so it's very likely that they're going to keep poking at this. You're going to see a lot more recommendations of it. And eventually, they're just going to do it one day. It might not be in the next few days, as the Federal Reserve is meeting on the 28th, if I recall correctly. But they're still going to do it at some point in the not too distant future, probably in a couple months at the minimum.
TLDR, they're going to start using savings accounts to finance the loans for their quantitative easing cycles.
Mm-hmm. Basically, all these bailout programs, the checks that are being cashed to American families, the businesses that are being bailed out, interest rates cut to zero, expanded quantitative easing, and then possibly now negative interest rates. One of the best analogies I've heard for this is basically it's like a junkie trying to avoid the hangover that and withdrawal symptoms that come by constantly shooting up again and again and again. You know, the high is wearing off. He doesn't want it to wear off, so he sticks the needle in his arm another time. Now, granted, if you keep sticking the needle in your arm, you prevent the withdrawal symptoms from taking place. But you also ensure that when you actually run out of drugs, the withdrawal is going to be even worse, or eventually you OD. And that's pretty much what the U.S. government is doing. They are staving off the inevitable recession, depression at this point that is going to hit by constantly trying to stimulate the economy by injecting more and more money into the system. However long they can keep that going on, all they're doing is guaranteeing that the crash is going to be even worse when it finally stops working. And of course, as was the case with Weimar Germany, Venezuela, and any of these other countries we previously discussed, once the people actually realize the currency is worthless, at that point, there's nothing that they're going to be able to do. But Pumpkin Row, thank you very much for the super chat. My favorite minarchist is Joseph Stalin.
I'm so glad I started that meme. My favorite minarchist is politician.
I mean, we should. I think I can speak for most of us here when I say that we should have a moment of silence for the loss of the world's greatest minarchist, Kim Jong-un, who, according to U.S. intelligence, died yesterday. So let's take a moment of silence for the world's greatest minarchist. All right, moment of silence has passed. So what's the next topic?
So Kim Jong-un is gone, huh?
According to U.S. intelligence, I don't believe the Democratic People's Republic of Korea has formally announced that he's gone.
Yeah, but I mean, it's kind of obvious that something's happened. He hasn't appeared in the spotlight in like a month, so publicly, and they just had like a big ceremony yesterday. I think it was like the anniversary of the North Korean government being founded, which traditionally the head of state's always supposed to be there, and he wasn't there for that for like the first time ever in the history of North Korea.
So Kim Jong-un just became a good communist. Got it.
So
Yes.
something serious happened, and that's sort of what's being, I think, both insinuated by the North Korean government, that he had a massive heart attack and is either brain dead or actually dead. But yeah, that seems to be what the U.S. government is suggesting, as well as the South Korean and Japanese governments, that he died.
Mm-hmm. And one thing that the New York Post published an article about this on so earlier today at just after 12:36 p.m. Eastern time. It says that despite the how far behind the rest of the world North Korea is, 6.5 million people in North Korea currently have active smartphones. As a result, information in the country spreads much faster, and the North Korean government is finding it increasingly more difficult to keep their citizens in total information blackout like they used to. So if he is in fact dead, they're only going to be able to keep it on the down low for so long.
Well,
yeah, I'm torn, considering that the only people actually spreading that information are glowers. I don't believe it, like at face value.
I mean,
But the only reason I'm even taking it remotely seriously is what I told you about the sort of lack of the mysterious lack of Kim Jong-un's sort of stage presence over the last month or so.
Exactly. Which, I mean, at the very least, either if he's not dead, he's obviously in poor enough health that he can't make public appearances. All right. let me take a quick check here, see if there were any other articles I wanted to get to before the end of the stream. SO actually shared one just before this started regarding the South African land bank creditors offering loan default.
Which is just it's self-explanatory, and keep in mind that their land owning program is state-run, so...
Pumpkin Row, thank you for another super chat. I heard Kim Jong-un died from tripping on a bug.
You know what surprises me is that the saying, or at least the term, COVID-19 was manufactured. I'm surprised that hasn't replaced the Epstein didn't kill himself yet.
Well, I think it hasn't really. Well, it would replace it, and I think it would be a lot more widespread. But I think the reason it's not as widespread is because social media companies are actively censoring anyone who tries to suggest something of the sort.
Oh, that's true.
Like, if you try to posting those links on Twitter, Facebook has already said if you post quote unquote misinformation about COVID-19, they will block it or remove it from the site. And if anyone tries to click on it, the person who tried to click on it will be informed that it was misinformation, and then they will be redirected to the quote credible news sources such as the World Health Organization and the CDC.
Who was involved in manufacturing the virus to begin with.
Oh, yeah.
Again, it's just the narrative you see, what you see coming out from the state-backed media and coming from the politicians, be they Republican or Democrat. Now, granted, the various political parties claim that the other political party is totally screwed up. You know, they've got all the answers, and the other party is completely off base. But what they both agree on is that you are not smart enough to decide for yourself what you should do in this pandemic. Only the experts can decide what you are intelligent enough to handle, what news sources you should be able to watch, where you should be able to go, and what you should be able to do. I mean, that has to be decided by the intellectual elite.
And keep in mind that they have a class interest in trying to mislead you and trying to disadvantage you for the state's gain, considering that the state actually does operate around a zero-sum model economy.
Now, here's something that I find particularly amusing. You can't be trusted to educate your own hatchlings. You can't be trusted to own a gun. You can't be trusted to know right from wrong. You can't be trusted to know what news sources are accurate or not, but you can be trusted to vote. It's almost as if voting doesn't actually do anything, and they know that.
Interesting observation. No, seriously, I didn't even really think of that before, but yeah. How come they're encouraging you to vote right now when there's so much emphasis on staying home, not doing things for yourself, and just letting the state manage every aspect of society?
I wouldn't be surprised if they keep... Sorry.
Oh, well, if you were to assume that voting actually is a means of achieving political change, those two ideas kind of conflict with one another. But what were you saying, Philly?
I was just going to remark that I forgot what I was going to say, actually.
All right, Pumpkin Row, thank you again. Listening to Lord Filth and Esso Talk is bromantic.
Yeah.
I mean, it is true. We are the best bromance in agorism.
Well, we're one of the only channels that talks about agorism, despite it sort of over-representing in the libertarian movement currently.
All right. I do actually want to respond to this comment. Robert Heim says, can I have a source for COVID-19 being manufactured? Here's something I want to be clear about. I cannot prove that it was, and none of us are claiming we can prove that it was manufactured. What we can say is that up front, when this whole thing broke out, we were assured by the state-backed media that there was absolutely no chance that the Chinese government had anything to do with this. It originated in bats and was spread through the Wuhan local food markets there where they butcher animals there in Wuhan. Eventually, mainstream media outlets, to include Fox News, were forced to admit that there is evidence to suggest that the virus either originated in a lab, which is in Wuhan. Now, the question is being asked, was it actually manufactured? Was it just being researched in that lab, and lack of security protocols allowed an employee at the lab to get infected and then released? Again, I don't claim I can prove that it was manufactured. We don't claim we can prove that. What we can say is it's clear that the government, between the governments of the United States, China, and around the world, clearly had an incentive for this to happen when it happened and in the way that it happened. That being said, it is not unreasonable at all that it was. And the fact that they are fighting so hard against anyone who even suggests this, like, I'm not saying, I don't claim I know it, or that I can prove it. We are suggesting that the motives are there, and there's at least circumstantial evidence that would suggest that. The mere fact that you even suggest that that might be the case just has them scream, conspiracy theorists, you belong in jail, quit spreading these dangerous ideas. Like, look, if it isn't true, then the investigation should bear that out. You don't need to be afraid of people just asking the question. But the fact that they are so afraid of people asking the question that they're actually, the corporations like Facebook, the mainstream media, are working so hard to try and silence anyone who even suggests it, only, in my mind, lends credence to the fact that that's probably exactly what happened.
Oh, and I'm taking a completely different approach from my 2 cents. I'm stating, first of all, we have evidence that it was gene spliced, that the virus was. It's made up of a bunch of different diseases which have too much genetic variation among them to mutate together naturally in nature. And on top of that, we have on record the U.S. government giving a bunch of loans to the Wuhan lab, both from Harvard University as a front and directly through the CDC and the World Health Organization, along with all these other NGO, quote unquote, interest groups. So, no, I am saying definitively, yes, it was a virus that was manufactured in a lab, and we have relative certainty of who exactly it was manufactured by. And isn't it just like, even if you were going to completely, ignore all this evidence we already have, even if you were to completely disregard the fact that everything they claim is not true is immediately proven less than a day or two later to have been true beyond the shadow of a doubt, beyond to the point where there's no case to be made for the official narrative. Isn't it weird how everything that the state does seems to just be killing people, or they seem to be like the only things which seem to actually work as a treatment for it seem to be resources and drugs which the state has a monopoly on, and these pharmaceutical cartels the state works closely with have a patent on.
To say nothing of the fact
And
that
what I would say,
sorry.
I just want to say, I'm not disputing what Esso said about the evidence about the Wuhan lab itself, about its ties to Harvard University and the CDC. I'm not disputing that either. What I'm saying is that, and that absolutely is evidence that would suggest that it was in fact manufactured. Now, does all that in tandem? I wouldn't say that definitively. I wouldn't say that brings us to a point where I can definitively say this virus was specifically manufactured, as opposed to it was a virus that originated in animals and they were experimenting on it or working with it in this lab. I don't claim we can reach that 100% certainty level, but as Esso pointed out, that is evidence that suggests it, and it's evidence that's being completely ignored by the mainstream media.
Yeah, I'm just reading the chat right now.
As am I. We're getting close to the top of the hour here. So if anyone does, we have covered all the articles I wanted to for this week. If anybody has anything they want to discuss, now's the time to put it in the chat.
Provide proof. Where's the proof?
I just
God, and these people wonder why I don't respect them.
I just wanted to say to people like JC Armitage, I posted a video earlier, and YouTube, of course, being its bitchy little self, took it down. I will be re-uploading that video, not to YouTube, but to BitChute, and I am going to get a BitTube account, and I'm going to be re-uploading my videos to both BitChute and BitTube now because I've just about had it with YouTube. I can't even stand them anymore. So look for that.
Yeah, I was gonna upload a rant about COVID, but I'm happy just doing these streams every week because I don't even want to do that. Honestly, I'm just so sick of hearing about it everywhere.
Same thing. And the problem with trying to make a video is by the time you've done your research, done all the editing, and put it together, it's already old news. The news cycle's recycling so fast.
Well, the only thing I was going to say about it is how the overt contradictions in the media's reporting and just repeating these lies in abundance, it seems to be like a sort of psychological overload tactic, to where it's so obvious, that something's wrong that I'm pretty sure nobody is actually believing the officially state-approved narrative. But
you couldn't at this point.
Yeah,
they contradicted themselves so many times. Keep going back on what they said the day before. You'd have to. I think the point you're making is they're trying to overload people with information.
They're throwing so much at people that it overwhelms them, and in turn causes the reaction that everybody I've talked to seems to be experiencing, where they're just reluctant to talk about it because they're so sick of hearing it.
Mm-hmm.
There is one other thing I wanted to talk about before I was cut off, and that is de Blasio's snitching hotline that got just absolutely overloaded with dick pics and Hitler memes. I've shared that around with everyone I know, both online and IRL, and with the exception of one guy who is an unironic supporter of central planning, it was basically universally beloved.
Just goes to show that despite what designs the state may have for having total control over its citizens, if people don't comply, there's really not a whole lot they can do.
Oh, and I totally support that for the snitch hotlines. Stop them from functioning by just spamming them with a bunch of troll messages. Yes, that's how that's the subversive tactic you approach that with.
I think we should get Black Spruce in there to just like post something new and horrible to that hotline constantly. Think we can do that?
Yeah,
you'd have to ask him.
Yeah, well, he has a repository of the kind of stuff that they would not want on their hotline.
The pop video. You know which one I'm talking about.
I don't watch those videos, so no, and honestly, I'd rather not know. But suffice to say, I'm pretty sure whoever's going to be manning that hotline would not want to see it either, which is perfectly fine because I don't really care what they think. Yeah, the only other thing, which I only have 1 minute left, so I'll make it quick, is that there's a whole bunch of students now in college who are basically being forced to take their classes online and are demanding a refund. I don't think the university system is going to be around for much longer. I've been saying that for a long time, and while this will not destroy it, it will certainly hasten the process. I mean, how badly do you think universities are going to do once enrollment starts to fall apart and students are demanding tuition refunds, especially when they realize the fact that they're paying tens of thousands of dollars to pay for something that they could just do for free?
Exactly. And when if they can get a course from, any of these online services for $20 that they're paying, $10,000 for, as you said, for a university, the university model is completely going to collapse.
Yeah, and I like what Cent 1000 said. in that, yeah, the state influence is controlling how the virus is being reported. I think we talked about that before.
Yeah, we
where
talked
they're
about
counting
that on last week's stream.
if someone gets shot in the head, dies, and they had COVID-19, they count that as a COVID death.
If they get run over by a car and the reason they died is because their lung caved in, it's reported as a COVID death.
All right. Well, on that note, we have reached the top of the hour. Thanks everybody for tuning in. And we will continue this as long as we have to, monitoring everything that's going on. As always, we've been saying this every week, but we're going to say it again. If you have savings in U.S. dollars, now is the time to get your savings out of U.S. dollars. If you hang on to your currency for any substantial amount of time, you are going to get burned. And with that, that is my 2 cents. Take it for what it's worth.